Hello and welcome to our webinar. I'm Jessica Groskopf, an Extension Agricultural Economist for the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Today is a part of our center's weekly webinar series, which usually happens every Thursday at noon Central. Check out a full schedule on our website at cap.unl.edu. The Nebraska Rural Response Hotline remains a great resource for ag professionals and producers across the state, providing mental health counseling, information regarding legal assistance, financial clinics, mediation, and more. The hotline's toll-free number is 1-800-464-0258. Resources related to stress and wellness can be found at ruralwellness.unl.edu. Following recent widespread storm damage throughout Nebraska, we're about to hear from experts in agronomy and agricultural economics from the Nebraska Extension's Hail No team. They will cover options for dealing with damaged commodities from a production perspective and discuss the role of crop insurance and marketing. Throughout today's webinar, please place any questions that you have on any of those topics, agronomy, crop insurance, or marketing, either in the chat or the Q&A. We're happy to be joined today by Justin McMechan, a crop production and cropping systems specialist. Hi, Justin. We also have with us Nathan Mueller. Nathan is a water and integrated cropping systems educator. Thank you for joining us, Nathan. We have Jenny Rees, who's also a water and cropping systems integrated cropping systems educator with Jenny. And finally, we have Cory Walters, a grain marketing specialist. So we're going to go ahead and jump in to today, and we're going to start off with Nathan. Nathan, take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And I'm going to start off with this highlighting some resources that we put together to start off with, and then we'll dive into more details and specific questions, I think, with the hailstorms that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Can everybody see that okay? Great. Okay, so real quick, we back in 2014, after some hailstorms that were quite severe across the state, and we'll get into the data, Nebraska Extension responded with that with in-person meetings as well as some resources, but a lot of times our resources were all over the place on multiple pages, and so we did centralize things and apply for funds to bring to you what I'm going to be talking about real quick here at the beginning, called Hail No from Nebraska Extension. So I'm going to give a brief overview of our Hail No resources, introduce to you the people that put the resources together, what the resources are, and then where we're moving to next. So an overview. So why we're addressing hail, I think that the need for the meeting today is answer enough. An overview of where Nebraska is at in terms of hail. So in 2014, this would be large size hail reported to individuals, to the National Weather Service, puts these reports together. So in 2014, there was 624 hail events with large hail, and Nebraska ranked #1. So that was really the start of putting together the resources that I'll be covering. Fast forward to where we've been since then. 2015, we ranked 3rd among states in the United States. In 2015, in 2017, and 2019, all 3rd, usually following Texas or Kansas. Texas seems to be #1 most of the time, with Nebraska following it. So already this year in 2022, and this was as of June 14th, there was 271 large hail events in Nebraska, and so we're in #2 place. And this is a ranking where you don't want to be 1st and 2nd, unfortunately. So after the 2014 hail storms across Nebraska was a catalyst to bring to you this Hail No set of resources. We had resources on Neb guides, on Crop Watch, and blog posts, and kind of just in different places. And we needed to really centralize that so people could find and access information from Nebraska Extension quickly and easily. So those are repackaged, kind of rebranded, and shareable. And so that was a result in funding that we got through a USDA NIFA funded project that went from 2015 to 2018. So the area of resources is really broken up into 6 areas that really go through the chronological order of how we deal with hail events. So one is just understanding frequency, timing, extent of damage from hail in Nebraska, then to damage assessment, learning about our insurance policy and risk management, then moving to replant considerations, managing that recovery crop, and sometimes also utilizing a cover crop to deal with weed pressure. So real quick, the team, several people are on here. The core in the middle are people that have been a part of the team effort since 2014. So Justin McMechan, Jenny Rees, myself, Cory Walters, Chris Proctor, Darren Redfern, Al Dutcher, and Paul Yassa are pictured there left to right, top to bottom. And then we have two new people on the team, Melissa Bartles, she's a cropping systems extension educator in Lancaster. And then Candace Holbert, she's our AmeriCorps Vista member that's been actively working on the back end of further developing these resources the past year for extension educators. So resources that educators could have at their fingertips to share with producers across the state. So we'll be finalizing that and giving that to educators through later this year. So we didn't quite get to where we wanted to, but close. So we have some former team members, left to right: Ashley Mueller, Roger Elmore, Tyler Williams, Bob Klein, and Lisa Yassa were integral in developing these resources, and they were formerly a part of our team. And some of them were actually three of these five were actually the leads on this effort. So the resource package. There's really three categories within those six main topic areas. There's going to be three things that you see under those six topic areas. One is going to be infographics, easy shareable information that you can learn information quickly, share with your producers if you're an agronomist or private industry rep. Videos, everybody learns differently, so we have short videos, and as well as we have information on the website itself. So that's really the three part of resources across those six categories. So here's an example of the infographics. We've shared some of these on our social media. If you want to follow us on Twitter or Facebook, it's Hail No UNL. And the infographics, I shared those last week after a hailstorm we had in Saline County. And I think that was pretty useful, as well as sharing it out to my listserv locally. The videos are 3 to 4 minutes in length, different experts. So you will see Justin, you'll see myself, you'll see other specialists that highlight some information that you're really going to want to know as you move through that process, start to finish. And some of you are at the end of this, but it's helpful to maybe go back through and rewatch some of these earlier videos, kind of in this step of process of dealing with hail. Last, just the website, the resources on there where all of this is housed. And so what's next? We're still gathering feedback and have opportunities to make further updates. We do have a little bit of additional funding available to make refinements to these resources. So one thing I want to make everybody known, so if you're a co-op with the seed company, we do have a trifold brochure that highlights these resources in this website that we could mail to you, your business, and that way you'd have them on your channel available to producers. So please email me and I'll share my email and we can get those mailed out. But we want to make sure these resources are both useful and valuable to you, our constituents and clients here in Nebraska. So we're always looking for feedback. There is a survey at the website, and the website for everything I covered is cropwatch.unl.edu/hailno. So that's where both you can give us feedback and access all of the information that I just went through quickly. And if you would like any of those brochures to have hard copy there to highlight these resources at your place of business, go ahead and email me at nathan.mueller@unl.edu. Thanks for your time, everybody.
All right, I will get that Hail No website put in the chat. I also put Nathan's contact information into the chat box for those of you. Next up, we have Cory Walters. Cory.
Hi, yeah. Excellent on the resources there, Nathan. I want to jump over to marketing insurance for a few minutes here to give an overview on that. And to start that, I actually want to go back to the beginning of the year and respect that prices and yields are unknown. And we have to manage those things, knowing that there can be things happen coming forward that we cannot see. We cannot be surprised. And so this year we are experiencing events that are not often observed, and the combination of them is quite concerning. So we have yield prospects potentially going down, and we have prices moving up throughout this year. So that's very, very different. We cannot predict these things. We can only manage this. And so this exposes us to a lot of financial risk. And we need to tread carefully here because we don't want any unintended consequences. And we need to do it before it happens. We have to have a forward-looking management strategy and respect even the slightest risk. Those statements of well, I don't expect that to happen. That's not what matters. It's the financial cost of that happening. That's what matters, and we need to manage those things. And so the kind of the kicker here on this one is if we did go into the beginning of the year with these prices and we forward contract a little more than we normally do, and now we run into a yield issue with prices going up, we have we kind of get ourselves into a pinch point here that we need to get ourselves out of or stay away from. Crop insurance can help, but it has some limitations, and I'll go over that here in a couple slides. Sticking with the pre-harvest contracts, outcomes can get pretty wild here. We really have to get into the contract type, and then it's your price relative to the current price. So some contracts are easier to roll than others, and some may just have to be bought out, and just accept the penalties, knowing that you have potentially other crop to sell and other contracts, or even just the open market. My advice: go visit with your merchandiser right away. Let them know what you're thinking, so then they know what to expect and you know your options. And with insurance on this, if you are thinking about buying out and you plan on using crop insurance indemnities, you need that to the price you're buying out and the crop insurance harvest price to be linked. So you have to wait till we get closer to that fall price when we're determining that harvest price. Here's those prices right now. We're sitting clearly at a higher place, and we have a lot of time from now until harvest for these things to evolve. And of course, I have no idea where it's going to evolve. And this actually opens up a weird paradigm in crop insurance. So given that we have prices higher than the projected price, given that there is people that may guarantee a yield loss, you can actually now insure, if you guaranteed a yield loss, you can actually insure your harvest price by using the futures market. Okay, there's ways of doing this, and I'd be happy to visit with anyone about this. And it has some good points and has some bad points, but you can actually insure your harvest price using information today. So that exists if someone's interested in diving more into that. So what I recommend right now? Go on insurance. You need to go talk to your agent right away, of course, if there's any potential damage, and really sit down in your office, wherever that's at, and critically evaluate the trade-offs between all your choices. Use all your resources. Talk to the extension educators. They're experts in this. And respect the financial exposure of future events that we have not seen but may see. For example, suppose a frost comes this fall. In crop insurance, all contracts are the same, and you need to select a provider on the service they provide. We usually reveal people when things get stressed. So now you may be identifying the type of service that you're getting in a stress system. In multi-peril, this is very standard across companies, of course, the contracts, and then of course you have the service. In hail, yeah, it's a wild world. That's a private company thing, so you have a lot of different stuff that can happen there. I'm going to stop right here for now. I know I went a little fast over that, but if you would like to visit with me more about that, I'd be happy to talk to you. I'll put my email in the chat here in a second.
Thank you, Cory. And I've already dropped Cory's contact information into the chat, so you can see that. There. Again, I would like to remind you as a participant, if you have any questions for our panelists, if you want to go ahead and drop those either in the Q&A or in the chat box, we would be happy to address those. Up next, I would like to introduce Justin McMechan. Justin.
Great, thank you, Jessica, and thanks for the invite. I hope you can see my slides okay and everything came out great, thank you. So I'm going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes covering what many of you have probably done from the early hailstorms and some who may unfortunately be looking at the most recent storms we've had. So this will be a reflection to FCIC crop insurance documents on the assessment of corn and soybean, which are, we could talk about wheat, but we're not in a management decision with wheat. So the wheat is just what is really left out in that field, and there is a process for it. But we'll focus on corn and soybean, and we're going to focus on the early season part that we're really dealing with right now. What I want to start with is a time lapse. You may have seen some of these on social media. This is different than the one I placed on social media. There's a photo in the corner there. This is some corn that was pretty similar in stage to what many of you might have had, hailed at the V4 stage with a simulated hail machine. And what we're going to watch here over a period of the next couple of days on this is the regrowth of that corn. And this is of the hardest and most important things about hail damage and making a proper assessment is waiting. And you can just see the growth of that corn. Now, in particular, keep an eye on that one in the center here. This is something we'll be dealing with in these fields. That's a non-competitive plant that's emerging there, and they're going to change over time. Some of them tend to pull out of this, others don't. You can see all those leaves getting wrapped and tied up in that space. But you're getting a good understanding there. Now it finally popped out on day 10. And so you may be frustrated with your adjuster. I certainly understand that if they're deferring evaluations, but in some cases, we just don't know the outcome of those plants, even within that short period of time. So that's what some of you may be hearing. But just between that photo, the day of that hail event versus 10 days later, how much different things can look. I hope that really resonates with some of you, and hope you're seeing that in your field of some regrowth. Some will not. This is depends on the extent of injury that we see. And so a lot of our corn fit into this, the different growth stages that we see here. Those that were fortunate enough to plant later, and that's not something we normally want to do, but if you did, it was a good thing for a hailstorm because it couldn't get access to those plants. But moving across this chart from left to right, or this figure from left to right, you can see the growing point remains below the ground really up until about the V6 stage, and then it comes up above that soil surface, and you can see with all the leaf tissue removed, that exposed growing point. This is the transition period between us really being able to accept near complete above foliage loss to now having a growing point that could be impacted by hail. And this is Iowa State publication, Abendroth and Dr. Roger Elmore and others that were shown in some previous stuff. But really you can see, V3 stage plant is just a bunch of leaf sheaths that are kind of pasted together. So you can really remove a lot of that vegetation. These plants can respond pretty well without that. There is a small amount of yield loss, but pretty insignificant to the grand scheme of things if the population's alive. So for the case of corn, this is the FCIC document for corn. These do get updated quite regularly. I pulled a number of charts out just to walk us through the process of what this might look like. We want to know what the normal population was prior to the hail event. That's important to know what we started with, and then what we'll be ending up with for surviving plants at 7 days later. And so you'll be looking at 1/100ths of an acre, or what a lot of you may be doing if you're just checking your fields is 1/1000th of an acre. A lot of 30-inch row soybeans out there, so 17.4 feet down a row and counting the number of live plants. We could talk a little bit about those plants later on what an adjuster might reject as they count as a live plant or not in terms of tillering or wrapped or tied plants. Minimum of 3 samples. I was out with several growers, the week after this hailstorm, and it does make a difference across the field. So you want to avoid pulling into a part of a field and say, okay, I think I know where I'm at. Go across that field and really make sure. And then, for your adjuster, 3 per field, and they're adding an additional 1 for every 40 acres. Now, the critical thing is if you lean into that document, you're going to find 2 different hail reduction loss charts, one that goes up to the 10th leaf. And I'll talk about staging. I haven't done that yet. We're talking we're sometimes like V6 or 10th leaf. That's the conversion between National Crop Insurance Service and how they stage plants, and how we at a lot of the universities use the collar method. And so we'll help you out with the conversion between those. Through that 10th leaf stage, this is that initial thing. So this is where a lot of you would be going for your initial populations. If you planted 32,000 plants per acre and you found, in this case, maybe 23,000 remaining, you might be somewhere in that, if I have the right lines here, 91% of total production remaining in that field. So pretty quick and easy chart to estimate what the potential yield loss remaining based on your original stand and what remains in that field. And this is the 1/100th, so just remove a decimal, back up one, and you would end up at 1/1000th of an acre. So if you got questions, type them in the chat as we go. We're not intending to go through this really fast. My computer is just deciding to go ahead here, so I'm going to go back if I can. Okay, so this is the chart I was referring to. This is the Iowa State publication that really describes really well the different corn stage growth and development. And what you can see is the leaf collar method there. And we were talking about the 10th leaf just on the previous slide. That's under horizontal leaf method. So if I drag my cursor down here to the 10th leaf, if you're more familiar with the collar method, there's the V8 stage plant. And so our V6, V5, V6 is when our growing point comes above the ground. And that's horizontal leaf method 6.5 and 8. So really easy to work back and forth between the FCIC document and if you're more familiar with the collar method. And then, growth as well. Sometimes that height, be careful on height. It can be influenced by planting date and other things. So best to rely on collars or horizontal leaf method. So I think a number of people get frustrated on this, which is a lot of dead and missing tissue above the ground, and saying, well, we're just talking about live or dead plants. What about all the leaf material I lost as a result of this hail event? And we don't account for that defoliation until the 7th leaf stage or around V6. And I'll show you why in a second. There's very little leaf material currently above the ground up until that stage. So we can remove a lot of it and not really influence the yield that much. And I'll show you another study that Nathan was also a part of, and a few others that are on here that highlight some of that. We have to allow time. So if we're later in the season and past the 7th leaf stage, and this does happen to a crop, we can't make that assessment right away. We've got to figure out what of that tissue is going to die off. You can have tattered leaves and they can remain alive. So Bob Nielsen from Purdue has a nice photo showing that dead tissue beyond that point where it was snapped off. But in a lot of cases, some of that tissue is alive, still photosynthetically active, and wouldn't be a reason to contribute that to yield loss. So I think this is probably one of the more frustrating conversations I've had with growers, not for me, but for them, and trying to understand this loss. This is leaf exposure, area exposed by stage through the season. And so you see where we're at, V5, V6, we've only got about 6% of our leaf area exposed at the moment. And so there's not a lot above ground to remove from that. Once we get to V7, 16% and on up, that's where defoliation becomes a part of the assessment that an adjuster would use. So I want to move back a little bit to a project Chris Proctor and Roger Elmore and a number of people were a part of that. I was fortunate enough to pick up on this in 2015 and use the simulated hail machine. Lots of sites were hit as part of that hailstorm that Nathan mentioned, and Nebraska Extension. What we're really here for is to get into these events and help with what is a complicated decision. And so they established, and I used the following year, this scoring system, different from National Crop Insurance Services evaluation or FCIC's documents, in what would be live or dead plant assessments to, hey, we've got some live plants. They're growing at different rates, maybe over the next 7 days, or they have tillers that have developed on them. In the case of this 4.1 and 4.5, what is the productivity of those plants on a per plant basis? And how might that compare to what is the current methodology? Not that National Crop Insurance Service is wrong, but that we want to continue to challenge ourselves on the best evaluation methods. So I'll show this video because this highlights a little bit of how we did this, and it might resonate with what you're seeing in the field. This is a hailed area here. And you can see the scoring system that I just showed you coming in on each one of those points of those plants. So 2's relatively good regrowth, 3's relatively poor regrowth, dead plants, and then relatively healthy plants. You know, in the eyes of crop production, it's not good to see a lot of variation in growth in the field. And so that was kind of the question we were challenging. On this graph, on the x-axis is all those different, you know, damage, injury scores that were taken, and then grain weight per plant. And so there's that regrowth, that slower regrowth tends to suffer a lot more in terms of yield. This in part is due to those non-competitive plants that can show up. And then we've got the tillering development, which some of you may see. You may have a live main stem and a tiller, or just a tiller alone. They're looking at, you know, in the case of across all those fields that you saw, some of those are still 75% productive. That may vary quite a bit depending on the stage. This was V3, V4 when this hailstorm came through. And so there's a lot of consideration in that in making a decision. And this is just the following year, a study that was done highlights some of the interactions with diseases that we can see in terms of Goss's wilt, which can show up following these types of events. You know, it didn't play a really significant role except in a few cases, as you can see by the orange, the difference from orange to blue. But again, somewhat of a similar response in terms of the productivity of those plants, depending on the amount of injury that was out there. Now, when we compared these and graphed these, we didn't find a significant statistical difference in terms of the evaluation method here versus what FCIC documents use. So it's a little bit different, but it couldn't be justified on the fact that it takes so much work to do this. So it's a step towards maybe new evaluation methods in the future, but our current methods, you should feel confident that those methods do represent what the potential yield is left based on that study. And I won't spend much time on this because I know Jenny's going to focus on this a lot, but just a study from Benson in 1990, probably getting a little bit outdated because of the change in our hybrids, but an adapted early and very early variety planted on May 10th, and then that yield decline with planting dates. So as we look at between 10th and 20th of June on replants, just to see where we're falling in terms of the yield potential of those plants. I won't spend much time on it because I know Jenny will dig into it a lot more. And she may touch on this as well, but I think this is such a great tool. It's worth saying a couple times during this talk, which is the U2U tool. This, just if you're making a decision on a replant, looking at, you know, a hybrid you might be using and its relative maturity, it's worth typing it into here. It's not a guarantee. This is a model. They're not you know, completely free of any error. There's variability and productivity of plants over a season and how fast they grow. But it just gives you an idea if you'll make that window before potential first freeze in the fall, which is a big consideration on our replants. Okay, I'm going to move into the next step of this, which is soybean. And feel free, if you got questions on corn, to type them in and we can address them. This is something you may have seen on social media as well, just looking at soybean and recovery from hail. In the image here, that's unhailed soybean down there, so you can see how tall it was when it was hailed. This is reproductive stage soybean here. This was vegetative stage. There's the unhailed soybeans down this way. And you can just see how, I'll just pause this at 5 days and just take a look at how little regrowth has occurred in this field over the first 5 days. Now, I know you've probably seen anywhere from 4 to 6 to 7 to 10. 4 to 6 is when we have really ideal growing conditions. We see a pretty rapid response. If conditions are not as ideal, it's better to wait a little bit. And I just ask you to focus on this area that I just highlighted here, how it looks like it's still all dead in that field. And then we'll continue out to 6 and 7. Now you're starting to see regrowth in places here at 6 and at 7. And at 7, you start to see that green show up along that area that was heavily damaged by hail. And this is the original photo. Now, granted, we're 9, 10 days, it still is a lot less than what was there, with the unhailed, obviously, but it is regrowing relatively well considering the amount of injury that was out there. And so patience with hail. I know it's easy for me to say, and it's not my field, but I think some of us will be surprised at the potential productivity left in that field. And so we only find that out if we give the crop enough time to respond and grow. Okay, for soybean, it's a little bit different. We do have stand reduction. We have leaf defoliation, which is really something a little later around the R1 stage. I could just briefly discuss that. One of the things that we really have to pay attention to if we have live plants and we know what our stand is nodes cut off or broken. And then seed count is a much later thing. I just put it in there so we were aware later things do change. I've got a bit of a game here that's kind of somewhat hard to participate when you're online, but you can challenge yourself and identify what numbers here would be alive based on the photos that you can see in front of you. And so I hope nobody thinks number 1 is dead. It is clearly alive and untouched, in fact, by any removal of tissue. 2 and 3 both have that one remaining growing point, and that plant is rather favorable for looking at regrowth of plants. If you can see my camera, I'm holding up a soybean plant from my garden, because why not grow soybeans in your garden? But you can actually see we have a pair of unifoliate leaves here. That's the ones you see on the image. I hope that's coming through clear. And down here, those cotyledonary nodes have come off. And so they're no longer visible, but I can feel the node between my fingers if you run your finger up the stem, so that it may not look as pretty as that picture. But if we can continue across to 4 and 5, where all that vegetation's been removed, we still have nodes intact. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are all alive by the image that we see. 6 is dead. There is no growing point below the ground. As soon as soybeans emerge, it has died off. And you could make that call within a day of the hail event. If you have no growing points left on soybean, there is no need to wait. Those plants are all dead. It's when they're intact above the soil surface that you really need to wait for that assessment. And do wait. Nathan and I were talking just before the event, and Jenny and I were talking previous. You can have an intact node where growing can occur, and there can be so much injury below that point that it can tear up the vascular tissue, and that plant can still die. And so we don't know that until we've given that plant a chance to regrow. And so anyone could argue under a hail event that really 2, 3, 4, or 5 could be dead, depending on the amount of stem injury that has occurred to those plants. So yeah, if you disagree, then you've seen the reality of hail in the field, and you know that 2, 3, and 4, and 5 need time to regrow. So we'll walk through the next few steps here in terms of 2 tables again, like we saw with corn, for determining what is remaining from a plant stand assessment. 10 feet of row. If for some reason soybeans were broadcasted, use a square 3 by 3 feet. Determine the original stand and what's live, dead, missing, or not emerged. What should have been in that stand prior to the hail event, and then the number of live plants that remain after that hail event has occurred. A similar chart here, just rows and width in inches. A 30-inch row. If you have around 140,000 plants out there, you should expect to find about 80 plants in that 10-foot of row. And this chart continues. I just sliced out a small chunk of it, but you could find your row spacing in there to what the expectation is for population and what you should count. This is population response as a graph taken from the same FCIC documents. There's a ton of documentation on the productivity of soybeans and that population that is present. I just want to note that as you look across from 180 down to 90,000, you really don't see things separate much from the x-axis. All those are less than 10%. So 90,000 early in the season, pretty good. And then, really at this point in the season, 65,000 plants is enough of a population that the replant. There are other considerations beyond that in terms of weed control and management, but generally those plants are pretty productive. Okay, one of the more tricky things, and I'm going to dig back out my soybean plant, and we're going to cut this poor plant up into little pieces and just talk about it through the process. This applies at V1 through R3.5 stage. Now, V1. Just to clarify the differences between National Crop Insurance Service evaluation for stage of development and other methods that we normally use is how I typically stage plants is each trifoliate. So one here, and one here. V3 stage plant, these leaves are still together. National Crop Insurance Service includes this as a V stage. So V1, 2, 3, 4. So our traditionally V3 plant with trifoliates is a V4 for National Crop Insurance Service or FCIC documents. And you can see applies through the R3.5 stage and then 20 plants, the total number of nodes per plant. and then beginning at the node above that unifoliate leaf for this case, and you'll see a little bit different in the others. So nodes cut off or broken. And so on some of our plants, we may have them, they've been bent or broken. We'll see that tissue above there die in that case. And that would make that assessment relatively easy. That is also part of what is the cutoff count. And so on your screen, you can see 12 to 13 nodes present on that particular plant. On our hail damaged plant, 7 nodes remaining. And so we could lean in and say, well, that's right around 54%. So that would be a 25.8% loss because of those cutoff nodes. Just so we all know for our own crops and where we were at, this is from 50 to 100% of nodes cut off. Still, when they say 100%, we still got that cotyledonary node intact. So the plant is still alive. But you can see if we remove 100% of nodes from those plants at a V1 to V2 stage plant, we're looking at 19.1% loss in that second graph at the bottom to the far right-hand side. Just 50% cut off, 6.9% loss at the other end. So this is an important consideration. So defoliation begins at the R1 stage. Then we would remove cut off or broken, and then the remaining tissue that was left, look at how much of that tissue is remaining. And this is an additive process. Few final notes, mid to late May plantings, around 75,000 plants or so is kind of what we're looking for. Mid to late June, looking at about 60,000 plants per acre as a stand. Interplanting, planting perpendicular to existing stands, and then a complete replant, looking at increasing that by maybe 10% for pod height. And then narrow row spacings, drilling, you can have depth issues for uniformity, but canopy closure, right? If your weed scientist was here, they'd be saying, hey, get canopy closure because of the weed control issues. So that would be a reason to go with narrow row spacings. And then after June 15th, you really got to watch what the potential is for that, whatever you're planting, maturing in time and not getting caught by a frost. Half a maturity group to one lower than what you're normally planting out there might be good. Stick with the maturities that are in your area though. And if you're having trouble making that decision, Iowa State University has a great tool, much like the U2U tool, which you can actually pick. I just chose Southwest Iowa, June 15th planting, a 2.5 and a 3.5 maturity group. And then you can see on the bottom here, the likely those will make it before first frost. And that 3.5, as you can see that blue mark out there past that risk of frost, runs a risk of getting frost on it. So that's something definitely to consider when making that decision. So that's what I had. My email's there, my Twitter's there, and I'll pass it back over to Jessica unless we have any questions.
Yeah, so there actually is a question in the chat. And again, I would encourage our participants, if you have a question for our panelists, feel free to put it in the Q&A or into the chat box. So the question is, and I'll throw this to all agronomists, I'm not sure which one of you wants to tackle it. Are there any is there any nutrition management to help soybean plants recover? Any nutrition management to help soybean plants recover?
Jenny's covering some of the management to follow. Jenny, I don't know if this was part of your set or not, so I maybe pass it. No, okay. Nathan, any comments on that?
Yeah, I have my PhD was in soil fertility, all on non-hailed fields. Actually, luckily, out of all my studies, we didn't have hail in 3 years at my research site. So I was the luckiest grad student ever. So no, not that I'm aware of or come across in the literature. That's not to say that I'm up to date on all of that. So that would be a good follow-up question that we could dive into. So maybe drop me an email and we can look into that a little bit more, but not that I'm aware of on the nutrition soil fertility side.
All right, well, we're going to jump over to Jenny Rees. Jenny, you want to share some pictures and some management strategies?
Hey, thank you for having me today. And oops, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully you can see that.
We're still seeing the regular layout. We need the presenter view if possible.
Is that better?
Nope, we're still seeing your plain. There you go. That's it. Found it.
Okay, you got it?
Yes, you're good.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, we feel badly for everyone that's been impacted by hail, and it just seems like we keep getting impacted. These are just a range of symptoms that you're probably seeing. In the area I serve, we had damage occurring to corn plants from emergence to fields that were actually V8 a week ago that were hit. Soybeans, we had anywhere from emergence to even V4, V5 stage. So what I'm going to do is just walk through how I go out, how other agronomists go out and do damage assessments, and then also show you recovery pictures along the way. So in this damage assessment, when I've been going out to growers' fields, and this is our intern Kaylee who's here with me today, basically I find a tall plant in the field and we split open that plant just to determine what the growth stage is. If you have an agronomist, you may have already known what the growth stage of those plants were, those corn plants, but it's important because we want to know where that growing point is. As Justin said, that growing point comes above ground in corn at V6. And so it's important to know, was the growing point above ground or below ground when that storm damage hit? So we split open the stalks. And in this case, what you look for is there's 4 nodes where the leaves attached to them, the first 4 leaves attached to those nodes, in an upside down triangle at the base of the plant. Then you'll see about 1/2 inch and you'll see a band, and that's node 5. And then about 1 inch, and then you'll see node 6, and that's where it comes above the ground. From there, you may have had more collared leaves. If you don't have anything above this triangle base, or even just beyond this one band, then your growing point was below ground. So what I do from there is just take my finger and I find where the soil line was on that plant and measure with my finger where the growing point occurred on that plant. And then that helps me as I'm assessing and going down the row, have an idea, measuring the stubs and the stumps that are left to see, okay, does this plant have a potential to recover or not? Gives us an idea. This is just showing you some recovery pictures. So this was V6 to V7 corn on the left, and that was June 7th that we had that hailstorm. And so I went out there and I assessed that on June 8th. This is what it looked like on June 14th. And in this case, this field recovered pretty well. It shot a lot of tillers in this field. So that original stump may have been gone, but it shot a tiller. And so those are things to keep in mind. Maybe we can ask Justin some questions about that later. This was V3 corn. And I've been hesitant to just automatically say that anything from emergence to V5 would automatically come back. And it's because through the years, I've seen so much bacterial soft rot set into plants from the top down. And I'll show you some pictures of that. But in this case, all these plants were basically cut off at the ground. Very few are still standing, and I wasn't sure what to tell the grower. So we watched it, and most of them came back, thankfully. And so June 14th, he had fairly even growth. These are some things I'm seeing on the recovery. So what I have circled here, that was the original stump of the plant, and you're seeing tillers. And I'm seeing a lot of this in the area that I serve. It's not necessarily the main plant that's coming back. We're getting tillers coming back. And it's also pretty hybrid dependent on that. Some other things we're noticing is you'll often see wrapping, especially on those taller plants. So when that whorl gets wrapped, so wind and sunshine are helpful for us in basically allowing that dead tissue to slough off. And when I'm going out there doing assessments, I'm looking for a pinch point, like where you see the arrow here on this picture. I'm looking to see if it's starting to slough off and if it possibly could in the future. Some of these are just so tightly wrapped, they're not going to basically break loose. And so then they won't be viable plants. There's a lot of other things we're seeing with all the damage to the stalk itself. we're seeing how the new regrowth, the growing point was below ground or below the point of major damage, but it can't push through the damage on that main stalk. So it's been doing things such as pushing out the side of the stalk. And again, all of that is trapped. It's not going to be viable plants in those cases. This is what I was talking about in some of these fields that were V3 to V4 stage. And so when I've been going out doing assessments 6 to 7 days later, there's plants where you'll see that there's new regrowth, but then you'll also notice in the whorl some brown. And on those, I kind of just peel it back, and what you see is some rot. This one I slid open so that you could see it's bacterial soft rot setting in. And basically it's moving down towards the growing point, and it will kill that growing point. So these are also not viable plants. So this is why the waiting is hard, but this is why it's so important, because you really don't know what you have unless you do the waiting. And the waiting is also hard right now because of the critical time frame we're at for making these replant decisions, and also with federal crop insurance last Tuesday for corn for those decisions. These are some fields I was looking at June 14th before we got the second round of, well, the hailstorms that night and into June 15th. So a lot of these fields that got hit June 7th got hit again June 14th, and that made our decisions easier. But this is what Justin was explaining, where you get tall plants and short plants. It's important then to do stand counts. In some of these areas of the field, I was getting 15,000, other areas 23,000. And so then there's trade-offs there, and it's also trade-offs of the fact you've got these smaller plants versus taller plants. But at the end of the day, they don't restart. They're all the same growth stage. So those are some things to keep in mind as well. These were, that field had been a V3 to V4 field. This field had been a V7 to V8 field. And you can see on some of these plants just how they're still so wrapped. What crop insurance in my area has told me so far is that they're not counting plants that are wrapped. They haven't, in my area anyway, been counting tillard plants as much either. So this was a V3 field, and something that I've talked about to growers in my area, and we also shared it on Crop Watch last week, was this replant consideration. So if you need to replant, are you going to go back in with corn? Are you going to go back in with are you going to go in with soybeans? Are you going to go in with milo or sorghum? Or are you going to go in with a cover crop? And so what I was recommending to producers in my part of the state, the number one question with all of that is herbicides. So what was the herbicide that was down in these fields? Will this successive crop come through it? Now, in our weed guide, we have the replant and rotation restrictions, and we all know that. There's also just a lot of experience that agronomists in the state have as well regarding what's been seen that actually comes through. And so what I've been recommending to producers is, if you think you might be in a replant situation, take a hoe and seed in some soybeans, seed in some milo, seed in some cover crop seed, and just see if they come through that. I've been saying to seed them shallow, so 1 inch or less, because hopefully you're above the herbicide band. Hopefully the herbicide band has moved down, depending on what you use for pre, depending on what you use for a post. And at least it'll give you an idea if you got something that comes up. So for most of the places in the state, we had some significant rain. It's going to be a little bit before we can get back in and replant. So now might be a good time, get out there and just take a hoe, seed some seeds, see what comes up. In this case, this producer found that the soybeans came up fine through what his pre and his post herbicide was. On the soybeans, Justin already covered this. So we have a lot better potential with soybeans to regrow as long as these stems weren't hammered so badly to disrupt the xylem and the phloem, as Justin already mentioned. So you can see here, what I just wanted to show is in between where the petiole meets the main stem, you can see how large some of this new regrowth is on this hail damaged plant. And this was a really early planted field and it got hail damage, not to sticks. And so you can see all the regrowth occurring there. Okay, moving into replant. The number one question I'm getting today, because so much of my area of the state has been hit now a few times, is what is the potential of the crop that's out there versus if we replant at this point? So the reality that we're all facing at this point is, Justin mentioned that U2U tool, where you put in your hybrid maturity, you put in your location, and you look at when it would potentially mature compared to our 30-year average frost freeze date of 28 degrees. And as we're looking at possibly June 20th right now, for a lot of us to even get back in the fields, we need to be looking at 100-day or less for most of what we'd be replanting. We know that corn seed's in short supply, so you need to be talking to your dealers and working with them. Soybean seed is in short supply. And so this is one way to maybe make some of these decisions. This is in your, if you have this available, a corn and soybean pocket guide. Jim Specht is actually, he just popped in today, and so he's joining me today if you have soybean questions. But he's one of the authors of this. But in there, this is one of the charts. So what it's saying is that if you planted April 20th through May 5th, and you planted 30,000 seeds per acre and ended up, let's just say, around 30,000 plants per acre. If today you're sitting at a stand of between 10 to 15,000 plants per acre, you still have a yield potential of 71 to 81% of your original potential, barring additional things happening with weather events, barring stock rot setting in, so forth. But it just gives you an idea anyway, versus if we were replanting today at 30,000, we'd have about 53% yield potential. Now, some of this I have a little bit of a hard time with from the standpoint, we know that our hybrids have come a long ways, as Justin said. Our hybrids have come a long ways, and we know that every year is different. So we've even seen in the past, like last year, we had a late fall. We saw some June planted corn yield really excellent last year on some of these hybrids. So it's not a guarantee, but it's one way to make a decision beyond even the crop insurance things that Cory was talking about. There's also, and I failed to put this in this PowerPoint, but within our soybean, we have the soybean replant decision guide. Justin shared some of that as well. And that's on page 38. We will have all these resources in a Crop Watch article this week for you to look at. But even as Justin shared, you go down, according to this chart, 35 to 70,000 plants per acre right now, and your yield potential is still above 50%. It's actually more in the 70s to 80s. And so just don't give up on these early seeded crops too much. The biggest thing that we're concerned about is weed control. The weed control thing are things that we can't, talk to your agronomist. There's a lot of people out there with experience, agronomists, ag industry, and so forth that can help with some of those things. Another option can be cover crops. So for those of you who have a livestock option, this is a guy who just intentionally wanted to see what would happen if he planted corn from 10,000 up to 30,000 plants per acre. And he planted some sorghum in here as well. So in his case, he wanted to just basically take it and allow it for grazing. Another guy last year, this is a situation, it was a 10 to 13,000 stand from a hail situation that happened late June. He's a guy who has cattle and he needed those corn stalks for grazing. So what we did is we went in and we interseeded cover crops into this, and he ended up taking it to harvest. This is to the line. You can see in this row over here, the row next to this is where the cover crop ended. And then where there was no cover crop, basically all that light interception allowed for a lot of palmer growth. The field made between 90 to 120 bushels an acre. What he recommended in this is that instead of taking it to harvest, he wished he would have just used it for silage. Because of the biomass that cover crop created, it would have been a great forage option. So we can also talk forage options with your questions too. And I'd like to stop right there and ultimately just open it up for questions.
Well, thank you, Jenny. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat or in the Q&A, so I would encourage you as a participant, if you have any questions for any of our experts, that you go ahead and drop those in the chat. One piece Jenny brought up was the tillers. So Jenny, do you want to rephrase that question? And it sounds like Justin, maybe you have some potential data related to that. And as we listen to that answer, we will also look for more questions from participants, either in the Q&A or in the chat.
Yeah, Justin, so when you were doing your research, like how much potential do those plants with the tillers have compared to just a normal plant for yield?
Yeah, quite a bit. Not our original plant, right? There's nothing that's going to be up there with that group, and this is one hybrid. So you mentioned hybrids and their differences. They, I guess, just adding the words of caution to the interpretation of a smaller data set like that. But they were yielding anywhere between 50 and 75% of what was an undamaged plant. And the value of that, and that's can't be captured in these hailstorms, is that we can actually leave areas undamaged when we run that hail machine. And so we have directly adjacent, completely undamaged plants to compare to. And so they have big error bars on them. So that's a caution too. And those error bars signify the amount of variability that we have in the yield response of those plants. But the mean of the response was anywhere between 50 and 75%. Is there other gaps to fill in on that? Lots of research, I think, that needs to be done. If there was anything that came out of the last couple of days talking with growers, we can certainly help going forward, I think, and understanding these complex situations a little bit more.
So we do have a question in the chat that says, how concerned are you about Goss's wilt and other disease issues in standards that are left, and recommendations for scouting as we go through this season?
Yeah, that's a great question. So plants are more susceptible to Goss's wilt early in the season compared to later. They don't have as much resistance built up. And so I've seen Goss's wilt even on B6 plants. So how you determine Goss's wilt is, if it's Goss's wilt or not, is that plant, if it starts dying, you take that plant and you actually take that stalk and you cut it perpendicular to the stalk. And you're looking for discoloration in the vascular bundles. Industry has done a great job of breeding for resistance to Goss's wilt. So what I would say is that unless the producer has a history of Goss's wilt, or unless the producer or if the producer was using a hybrid that doesn't have much for resistance, those would be the situations that I would be looking for that more. I can't say that I've been seeing that setting in so far yet, though.
I was just going to share that graph really quick. I think this highlights what you covered, which is a resistant variety and a susceptible variety to Goss's wilt. And they hold up pretty well. This study was done where we hailed and then we immediately sprayed with Goss's wilt, trying to actually cause the infection to see what it would do. And so just to show some data that was generated in Nebraska not too long ago on that it's hard to get it to take. At least you got to be, it happens kind of with the storm. Anyway, sorry.
Any other scouting or disease issues that we need to be cognizant of?
I feel like I'm the bearer of bad news. One to watch out for is soybean gallmage in this scenario if you're in eastern Nebraska. And I don't do this to cause any more heartache for growers. But if you have hail damaged fields and you have a remaining plant stand that is there and you're going to plant into that with new soybean, do pay attention to those existing plants and whether or not they get infested. You are more than welcome to call me and I can come out and take a look for you as well. If you think you might have an issue with it. That's new territory for us. We know soybean gallmage is attracted to those hail damaged plants if the plants survive. This early in the season, we're less knowledgeable on. We did a lot of late season stuff, so we're learning with people as well. But we have unfortunately hail damaged research sites for soybean gallmage, so we're going to be learning anyway.
All right. As we look for those final questions, we are on the 1 o'clock Central time frame. So I'm going to give a last call. If you have one more question, you're welcome to sneak it in. While we're waiting for that last call, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Just as a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu, where you can also register for our other upcoming webinars that typically happen on Thursday at noon Central. Ryan has put in the chat box, there is a brief survey to get your feedback on this webinar and inform our upcoming sessions. So my last call did not yield any questions. Any final thoughts from our panelists before we close out today?
I would just say we'll be following up with information on cropwatch.unl.edu, and we can have these charts on there as well. And to me, this is very much a combination of both crop insurance and agronomy, because like for Cory, with Tuesday being that deadline for the replant with corn, maybe economically some of these guys, it was better to have it totaled out and start over. I don't know. Is that something that you want to kind of talk to on the economic side of how you work through something like that?
Well, yeah, naturally we want everything totaled out, because then we max out our indemnity and don't oftentimes have to do a whole lot then. So, but the reality is that most observations come with a yield. Like you said, manage the weeds, get your yields. We're at this point in time. Think through all these options you have. I'd stress from playing the crop insurance game, let's make this as bad as possible. That yield goes into your APH, and it can impact future years. Of course, there's maybe a few things that work around that, but I would manage the best you can. So you got a good thing going in next year, and then of course update your decision making your for next year, especially the risk management stuff. If you caught yourself maybe not with quite the coverage you wanted, because these events are showing up, and it's reevaluating how we think about rare things. It's unfortunate, but it's there. It's in the game, and we have to manage it.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to end our webinar. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And again, a recording of this webinar will be posted on cap.unl.edu. Thank you for joining us.